This video, I'm going to be talking about reflexes, and your book refers to them as reflex arcs, and they've been referred to as arcs for many years for reasons we'll get to in a second. But if you look in that picture below, you can sort of see this concept of an arch or an arc. What are reflexes? Is it an action that the body has, and it's from something that we call stimulus? The stimulus triggers that action, and it does not involve the brain. So when we talk about reflexes, truly, the message does not get sent to the brain. Your body has receptors outside of it and inside of it, all kinds of different types of receptors, and those receptors are generally specialized parts of a neuron dendrite, depending on what they are receiving, whether it's light or heat, or in this case, this picture below, there's pressure and touch. Those are dendrites that are being stimulated, and that's what we call the stimulus. So here we have our stimulus. It's going to stimulate a dendrite, which will activate a neuron, and the neuron will signal to the central nervous system. With regard to a reflex, we have different neurons. We have neurons that are sensing things, which we call afferent, and you need to learn that word, afferents. That's said a lot. And then there are neurons that cause actions, and those are called motor neurons or efferents. Afferent and efferent. In English, sometimes we say effect, and it's hard to differentiate the word affect versus effect, because oftentimes people say side effects, and it sounds the same, but it's not. This is the cause, and this is the result. This is towards the central nervous system, and this is away from the central nervous system. And then connecting the two types of neurons, sometimes, but not always, there is something called an interneuron, and inter means in between, thus it's an interneuron. So afferents send nerve signals, which we call impulses, to the spinal cord or the brain, and the brain. In this case, I just told you if it's a reflex, there's no brain, so this would be a sensory neuron. And then a motor neuron is going to send the information from the spinal cord or the brain, in this case, once again, reflex is no brain, to something that's a muscle, which we would call an effector, because it causes an effect, or a gland. And glandular epithelial tissue means that the type of cells that are living in the gland are these closely packed ones, like sweat glands or saliva glands, for example, milk glands. And so you'd have a gland having some kind of an effect. Like you get too warm, your body detects the warmth and you sweat. But in this case, we're really going to be talking about movement reflexes, which we would in school normally test in the classroom. Notice interneurons are just going to be the in-between, and thus they're called interneurons. So here we can see in this picture that there's a stimulus that's detected. And here, if you look at this very simple drawing, these are cells. And these are the dendrites of the neuron that are detecting the stimulus, whatever that is, pressure, light, temperature. And then this is the cell, and the signal gets transmitted to another neuron in this case. And this is a little bit more complicated. And then eventually the signal gets passed along, if you look further in the drawing, to a motor neuron. And the motor neuron, if you look at the red down there, that's a picture of muscle cells under a microscope. And in this case, those are the effectors, and they're going to cause a movement, and we call that the effect. So the effector is a muscle or a gland, and then this is a simplified picture, and you can see why we call it an arc, because it doesn't arc like this. It's a one-way sort of situation, and we would say reflexes are pre-programmed from birth, that when you're born, you should have these reflexes that are designed to protect you. And if you watch the video on reflexes, we know that reflexes are designed to protect you from harm. And in this case, like a sharp object or hot. So I think the video had the hot object. And if you touch it, you pull away from it. And so you shouldn't have to think about this. And this makes it much quicker. Notice if the signal never travels, this is the spinal cord, if the signal only travels through the spinal cord and does not get relayed up to the brain. And here's your arc. It's not going to be going back and forth. It's just going to be one way. And so in this picture, this would be 3 neurons, and we would call it a 3-neuron arc, or sometimes you just have an afferent neuron. And we have 2 neuron arcs. Here's a picture which you often see when we learn about the nervous system. It's a piece of the spinal cord. So if we go back here, you take a slice, a cross-section of the spinal cord, it looks like this. We've seen this before, where it's sort of, they call this white matter on the outside, gray matter, they say this is an H shape on the inside. And here you can see the same thing, the stimulus. It's like a needle here. This is a very simple drawing of a neuron, just like a line with a dot, dendrites. Nerve impulse, sensory neuron, transmits the signal to the interneuron, which is located in the gray matter of the spinal cord. Transmits information. This is a motor neuron, and that motor neuron is going to signal this is a cartoon drawing of a muscle. Same thing again. So once again, this makes it much faster than having to involve the brain. As I said, some neurons are called 2 neuron arcs because they involve 2 neurons, and some neurons are called 3 neuron arcs because they have 3 neurons. Self-explanatory. Obviously, 2 is more simple than 3, and there's going to be less ability to interfere with that signal, meaning if that stimulus activates that neuron, you're going to get that response. For example, shining light into somebody's eyes, you're going to get the pupil to shrink. And so you only have a sensory motor neuron for 2 neuron arcs, and 3 neuron arcs are going to have the sensory, the motor, and the interneuron. Notice I put inter in between because that's a sequence of events. And you can see here in the picture, once again, that's a diagram of the skin. Something touches the skin, stimulates the dendrites, and you can once again see that green interneuron, which in this picture is labeled the relay interneuron. Relay neuron, it's the same thing, just a different name. So notice in anatomy, sometimes we have the same thing with different names, and sometimes different things have the same name. So it gets a little confusing. And there you can see the muscle cells, the muscle fibers. This is a picture of the spinal cord, the spine with all the backbones. And here, if we zoom in on these backbones, we can see they have the shape. So this is bone. And so if you look from like a top view, a bird's eye view, and here we have the spinal cord passing through the center of these backbones. So it goes down your back through the center like this. And so if we look at one of these bones from the top, we'll see here, and here you see the spinal cord. And notice, once again, here's your gray H if you want to know where that is in your body. So this is bone matter. I'm sorry, this is the bone with this crazy shape. And sitting in the center of it, there's the spinal cord. And then branching off from the spinal cord, you have nerves. And here we have this again, so you can see where your gray matter is and where your spinal cord is. And if we go now, let me go back here. You see these things called ganglia. One of these is called a ganglion. It's a bulgy thing. So if you look at a person, here's their spinal cord, and you took away everything except their bones and their spinal cord, and nerves, just their nerves, you would see these little bubble things, and the bubbles have been named ganglia is plural, and ganglion is one. And dorsal means towards the back, right? So these were named dorsal, and ventral would be toward the front. So now if we go to the next slide, we can see your central nervous system has neurons that we would call preganglionic because they're before the ganglion. This is the ganglion. It's that little bubble thing that we just saw. And then postganglionic. So we could call this presynaptic or postsynaptic, where neurons communicate. Or in this case, since this is the ganglion sticking out of the central nervous system with the spinal cord, the neurons exit the spinal cord and come out between the gaps between the vertebrae, the backbones, and then they start connecting with other neurons, and this thing from an anatomy term is called a ganglion, and that connects to what we call effector organs, and here are some examples of effector organs. And so by definition, a ganglion is a group of nerve cell bodies. Here's the cell body. And notice this is the peripheral nervous system because this exited the spinal cord and left. And in one ganglion, you could have a whole lot of nerve cell bodies. So we see this picture here. This is the posterior view of a person, it's dorsal. That's sort of depending on where you look, this would be the spinal cord up high in the neck region, the cervical region. Here we have the spinal cord lower in the lumbar region. And here's some neurons exiting the spinal cord, which we now call nerves. And so this is what the body would look like. This is the bone here, the lower backbone called the sacrum. And this would be the actual spinal cord with these nerve fibers exiting between the gaps of the bones. And same thing, this is bone here. This is actually cartilage, which sometimes you call a disc. That's sort of like a protective coating between the backbones, right? So we have a cartilage disc, this is all bone, and then going down the middle is a spinal cord. And here you can see these ganglia, and some are dorsal, it calls them dorsal root. They're towards the back, and some of them are called ventral root, and they're in different places. So this is just straight up human anatomy, the body parts. This is how the body is arranged in everybody. Notice the dorsal root ganglia ganglion is singular, ganglia is plural, are known for getting the receiving signals from sensory neurons. So input from your senses goes in this way, goes in through the dorsal root ganglia, goes in this way. So here we have some sensory input in the blue. The body feels something, either in the skin or the joints or wherever. That blue neuron, those are the dendrites, travels up, goes up here, travels via the dorsal root ganglion right by your backbones, connects here with some other neurons in the spinal cord. Here's the gray matter of the spinal cord, and then exits in a different location. So now the effector or motor neurons, efferent neurons, are going to exit out a different area called the ventral root. And this signal is going to send down to the muscle and tell the muscle to do something, and then the muscle contracts. This is an actual picture of a real person. There's a real spinal cord with a ganglia. It's just kind of cool. And I believe I will stop here for now.